All right, Mark Rogers TV talking Pac-12 football. We stop in Los Angeles and check in with Mike Regalado to talk about one of the surest positional battles in college football. I think it's a open and shut case, Mike, when we talk UCLA quarterbacks, but at the same time, there's much to talk about in regards to Josh Rosen's progression or hopeful progression from his freshman year to his sophomore year, and then the backup situation as well. So, Mike, again, thanks so much for joining us. And you got to be happy where you stand with what many consider to be the best quarterback in the conference.
Definitely. Yeah, already, with the off season, in full swing, a lot of sports reporters are giving their best predictions for next season. And already I've seen Athlon Sports had Josh Rosen as the best, as you said, best Pac-12 quarterback. ESPN listed Josh Rosen as the ninth best player in college football overall. So, there's a lot, the future's bright for the Bruins, especially in the next 2 years. Rosen had a stellar, true freshman year coming in to replace Brett Hundley, and even though the production took a little dip last year, before last season, UCLA had 3 9-win seasons in a row. Last year they went 8-5 with 2 losses to end the season, one to USC, giving the victory bell back to the crosstown Trojans, and losing, pretty much getting rolled over by Nebraska in the Foster Farms Bowl. So, there's definitely a lot that the Bruins want to improve on going into next season. But they're, as you said, they're pretty solid at the quarterback position, specifically because, Rosen was phenomenal. There's so much to talk about this kid going into next year. Last year he broke several records, both freshman and regular quarterback records. He threw for 669 yards, 23 touchdowns, had only 11 interceptions, which most of them were last few games. So it's actually pretty impressive to see how he did as a quarterback. And, he had his bumps and bruises, but for the most part, he was as, stellar as advertised. And, last year he didn't really have a backup quarterback. There was Jerry Neuheisel, but as much as UCLA Bruin fans love Jerry Neuheisel, definitely a drop in talent. But this year, the Bruins have, they're actually going to have a backup quarterback battle, which is really good because that kind of means 2 things. One, the future is set for the Bruins at quarterback, just in case anything happens to Rosen if he gets injured. But for the most part, now they can experiment a little with Rosen. They can, let him off the leash a little bit. Last year they didn't exactly want Rosen to, run everywhere because, one hit could end a season and then there's no quarterback. This year, before I get into this year, a lot of in high school in St. John Bosco, Rosen did a lot of options, and that's something we didn't see a lot last year, specifically because of why I stated there was no backup. But UCLA has had 2 backup quarterbacks in the spring. They're getting possibly 2 more in the fall. So there's depth there, and that's a good thing for the UCLA offensive coordinator Kennedy Palomalu, who is changing things up a bit. Last year they went with the spread offense under Noel Mazzoni. Now they're moving to more power-oriented offense. Not so much a pro style. Coach Mora got a little irked when someone brought that up during spring practice. But it pretty much is what he says. They wanted to tweak the offense. So what they're doing is bringing in fullbacks and tight ends, bringing the formations in a little tighter. But for the most part, they're still using a lot of elements from last year. During the spring showcase, I saw a lot of formations where they still had 3 or 4 receivers, on the offense. So they're using a lot of elements from last year, but they're changing it up this year. For Rosen, he has to adjust to a little bit more slower pace because they started using in-game huddles now. He's playing under center and not just solely in the shotgun, so they're mixing that up. So there are a lot of things that the Bruin offense has to, get adjusted to. But for the most part, it seems like Rosen is just, going to, have, a field day next year. Much improved sophomore from last year. He looked really good. He looked a little bit more stable, confident, which, it's a good thing for a kid that threw 3,600 yards last year.
What caught my eye, Mike, is obviously this kid hit the field in week 1 against Virginia and immediately looked the part, had an exceptional game in game 1. The next week, if I remember correctly, against BYU, had a rough 3 quarters, but made the plays in the 4th quarter that he needed to win when it was an extremely close game against the Cougars. Very impressive, not having your best day, but able to play well down the stretch to get the win. As you mentioned, 60% passer. But this kid's not necessarily dropping the ball off to the running backs on a frequent occasion or dinking and dunking. These are shots down the field, and so for him to complete 60% of his passes, very, very impressive. A lot of the interceptions, the Stanford game in particular, he was just fighting for his life. The pass rush was pretty menacing in that game. He had to chuck it around. They were down by 3 touchdowns most of that game, and he threw some picks in that game. And then he really surprised me because this kid is a classic drop back passer. That's the reputation. But what would have been the game-winning touchdown at the Rose Bowl against Washington State was when he split the defense, outran some safeties and defensive backs to the end zone for a long touchdown run to what would have been a sealed win before Luke Falk got his hands on the football.
Yeah, that was painful. That's one thing that I think both Rosen and UCLA are going to have to, grow up a little bit with. That's been a theme with UCLA. There are at least 2 or 3 games that the Bruins drop, which they should win. And like you said, Washington State was actually one of the biggest surprises. They kind of came out of nowhere with, Mike Leach's program came out of nowhere, especially after the first few seasons where they were a little horrendous. They were pretty bad. But they came out last year with Luke Falk, and they were throwing the ball around and were a huge surprise in the North. And so when they came down to Pasadena and shocked UCLA in the final seconds, Bruin fans did not know what to think. So it's going to be, it's those games, those little lessons that Jim Mora and Rosen are taking with them into next season. Part of the reasons they want to change up the offense is to, really utilize the strengths of all their players. Last year, I joked around with a lot of my writers on Gojo Bruin that, a lot of people on Twitter that Noel Mazzoni only had 5 plays. And essentially, that's what it looked like. There was like the bread and butter plays that they would always go to. But now for spring practice, UCLA has a lot to offer. They have fullbacks, former defensive players that are playing fullback, running the ball. They're passing, catching the ball in flats. They lose 3 or 4 receivers. I can't remember the number exactly, but for the most part, they, losing some good quality receivers. You kind of don't recover from that. But they have a lot of depth at receiver, a lot of good talent. So Rosen has a lot to work with. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how they evolve, how they use this power offense to their advantage. And also basically how they, use the backup quarterbacks. Cause they have a 4-year guy, Mike Fafaul, who's a walk-on, who played backup in the spring, but also they had an early enrollee, Matt Lynch, who was maybe expected to be the 3rd string, but he actually looked very good the last 2 weeks of spring showcase. I did say that in the fall they have 2 more guys, Devon Modster, who he was a former Arizona commit, decommitted in December and, joined the Bruins, committed to the Bruins right before signing day. And he's huge because he's one of the, best dual threat quarterbacks of the nation. And then a 4th guy, Diamond Lee, who's, he's coming in as a receiver, but he also has played quarterback. So, there's some depth right there. And in the fall, all of that's going to get hashed out. But for now, Rosen's the number 1, and there's going to be a very fun and interesting backup quarterback battle.
And as you mentioned, Matt Lynch coming in as a true freshman in the fall. Devon Modster rated as the 13th best quarterback in 2016, according to ESPN. But Fafaul has been there and has gotten in the reps, and he should know the offense. And so he's got a pretty clear, decided advantage, at least in terms of the playbook. Mike Regalado joining us from Gojo Bruin. Mike, we always appreciate the time.
Oh, thank you very much.